give a brief background, I believe, on her trip to becoming a TTP expert, and then have a discussion with Dr. Cataland, who we have up here running our technical. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Scully.
Thank you very much. Hello, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. And thank you, Spero, for inviting me to be able to speak, answer questions, discuss any points with the patient group today. I haven't got any slides prepared, but I can summarize what's happened to me with regards to my career. So training to become a hematologist is very different in different parts of the world. And in the UK, where I'm from and where I trained, after completing medical school, we have to do a period of general medicine or internal medicine and do a set of exams. And at that point, after the second set of exams, we have to decide on our career pathway, for which I chose hematology for two reasons. One is because I really enjoy clinical medicine, that is looking after patients, but also the laboratory aspect of hematology. And again, that may well be very different to the States, where people may just decide on the clinical or the laboratory basis for hematology. After completing 5 years of training for hematology, I then had the opportunity to do some research. Again, it's a different path to the States, but I did what we call an MD or PhD. And at that time, I did it in TTP, which was relatively new. So I started that in 2001. No, I didn't. I started in 2004 even. And the gene for ADAMTS13, which is the missing enzyme in TTP, was only characterized in 2001. But actually, at that time, the understanding of TTP and indeed the treatment was not satisfactory. So the two main areas when I was doing my degree, my postgraduate training, where I was looking at identifying assays to make it easier to confirm TTP. And secondly, I started using a treatment that many of you may know about called rituximab. So after plasma exchange and steroids, it was often very difficult to get patients into what we call remission, or everything was status quo with regards to their routine labs. And with rituximab, we could do that quicker, but also we could monitor the ADAMTS13 activity level and make sure not just the routine laboratory parameters were normal, but also the patient's ADAMTS13 was normal, and we could watch that and see what happened. And in some patients, it reduced, and in some, it did not for a long time. And in those in whom it reduced, again, I treated with rituximab, and it prevented them having an acute TTP episode. So that's what I did in my degree. And then we become consultants in hematology. It's like the highest grade after going through all the training. It's a different nomenclature to the States, and continued looking after a number of different disorders, but including TTP, and have identified a number of subgroups of TTP, have been involved with the big clinical trials in more recent years. And that's it. We've, as a group internationally, been able to share experience and share management. And as a consequence, I think that at an international level, not just at national levels, we all pretty much do similar things with regards to treatment, and more with monitoring, so that we can get patients into a quick remission, that is their counts are normal, then get their ADAMTS normal, and then monitor them over time. Now that still does vary even within countries, and part of the importance in speaking to yourselves today is so that you understand our rationale, which has in part to be manipulated depending on the patient's presentation and their disease course during the acute episode, but help younger doctors coming through and educate them about identifying TTP. By doing that, we can diagnose it quicker, we can treat it quicker. So now I'm very lucky that I have a number of young doctors who are doing the type of degree that I did after I'd finished my haematology training, so that they become specialists in what we call hemostasis and thrombosis, but with a particular interest in TTP. And then when they get their consultant posts, they can continue to expand the network of specialists that we have within the UK. I think that's my life in a summary.
That's all you got, huh?
That's it, no more.
Thank you for joining us. You know, you've done some...
Will you turn on your camera just so she...
Oh, I'm sorry. I was trying to hide from Marie. There we go. I'm trying to get in front of us. Oh, hello. Thank you very much for joining us so late in the evening on Saturday. I know it's probably getting close to your bedtime, so I appreciate you staying up a little later. You tell me, do you think TTP is treated the same around the world in your opinion?
Well, there's a number of different issues depending on countries' policies. So, for example, the availability of specific medications that we use, and we really use 4 main treatments. So plasma exchange, steroids, rituximab, and caplacizumab. But even in this era, despite, for example, the evidence we have for rituximab or caplacizumab, there are some countries where they still do not have access to these therapies. But I think within our international group, let's say, our mindset is the treatment pathway of those 4 main therapies. And then it's important that we support those within the country and different nations to ensure that they get all the therapies that we consider as a group of experts that patients should have.
Yeah.
The other thing, of course, is the ADAMTS 13 testing issue, which you know is my little bugbear.
So explain to people the differences. So the difference in how TTP might be treated in the States, where you have more decentralized care, versus how it's done in England, where I think you see mostly everybody. There were 2 or 3 centers that may see all. Explain to the US audience, at least, how things are different.
Well, firstly, your country is much bigger. So that does make it very difficult. But what we've done in the UK, we see about 40% of all the cases in the UK at our centre. But obviously, the north of England or Scotland, patients can't travel all the way down. We have a mantra that we want to get patients to site within 2 hours of where they are. And we've done quite a lot of work over the last 5 years, and it's finally come to fruition where each region will have one centre that just looks after TTP patients. So any of the smaller hospitals have to send them straight into those central specialist units, and there will be 9 in the UK. That doesn't include Scotland and Wales. And that is very important. One, because you've got people who have an interest in TTP, who can react to all the requirements, and there are a lot of barriers on presentation and moving patients and getting lines in and getting the apheresis team in and getting a bed ready. But if you've got a system that's used to it, it works much quicker because you can see such beneficial results. But within the States, it's just massive. And I think, you're working very hard to try and present a similar pattern to us in the UK, albeit we are doing it with a smaller region. But it is possible, and having 1 or 2 specialist units in each of your counties is perfectly feasible. I mean, you don't want somebody that hasn't got expertise in this condition looking after them. It's just terribly, terribly dangerous.
No, I think you're exactly right. I mean, the consistency of expert care is important in this disease. There's no question. And that's one of the struggles we have here. There can be, if you will, a different standard of care based upon where you may or may not present to the hospital. Let me let the audience know that feel free to ask questions of Dr. Scully, Professor Scully, if you'd like to. Don't let me monopolize this discussion. But I think what might also be informative to our audience, at least members of the U.S., we had some discussion about caplacizumab and access in different countries and how it's different. In the U.S., the drug is approved based on efficacy and side effects, adverse effects, without regard to any sort of price, cost, or how it's going to be administered. That is done by the market, if you will, the insurance companies, the government at some level with Medicare. But if you don't mind, discuss briefly how that drug was approved and similar drugs in the UK.
Well, the crux of it being approved through our regulatory process that is followed internationally is something called NICE. And the crux of it is that it was a randomized controlled trial. And it's not straightforward because they have a number of different targets they have to meet. And it didn't fall into highly specialized because it's not required for chronic use. So normally very rare diseases require therapy ongoing. So it had to go down like a standard pathway, like diabetic drugs or things like that. So it took some time, but it was recognized, the benefit. And the benefit is giving it as soon as TTP is confirmed, the platelet count rises quicker and patients can get out of hospital much quicker. They are better, quicker. And they did finally listen to expert opinion, but the company obviously had to do quite a lot of work. But if it hadn't been for the fact that it was part of an international randomized controlled trial, it would not have got through this process. So rituximab is not authorized for use as such in our country. It has to go down a different pathway. It's not such a big deal these days, but there's still people that have to apply for its use. Where Kaplan now is authorized for acute TTP.
So would you say all patients have ready access to caplacizumab?
All patients have access, and we have our own pathway in the UK, which is it needs confirmation that it is acute TTP, because I'm sure you've heard some of my other colleagues speaking where there are other conditions that can look like TTP where it's not, and it may not be appropriate for those conditions because it does cause or potentially cause bleeding, although that risk is extremely small in TTP because it's got an underlying different mechanism.
Certainly.
So we require in the UK that patients have confirmation of an ADAMTS13 that's severely reduced in keeping with TTP. And all the main centres now have caplacizumab stocked in their pharmacy, and that's paid for centrally.
Yeah, I think one of the benefits of the centralized specialized care is it in the distribution or administration of the drug. I think there's the potential for the safer use with people who have experience with it. And not that money is everything, but financially it will be used appropriately as well.
Yeah.
Have that sort of centralized care. And again, you just don't have the same sort of system here.
No. Or many other countries. I mean, there's still countries that don't have access to CAPLA. And that's because a lot of regulators require a certain fit, and TTP does not fit the model because it is a rare disease, but it's an acute life-threatening that can't be treated by one or two centres. It needs, more input because of the quickness of diagnosis and getting it to a centre with expertise, preferably, and use of plasma exchange. And so sometimes the regulators find that very difficult to compromise, acute versus rare. So there's not many conditions like ours, is there?
No, it's a unique one. So rituximab is not officially approved, as it isn't in the States. It is FDA approved for TTP. Does that cause a problem? So is access to rituximab a problem more than caplacizumab?
It has been in the past, particularly when it was more expensive. Less so now. We're going through another regulatory process, which means that everyone will have access to it. But, you know, rituximab is used so frequently in many hospitals in hematology that using it in TTP often is not noticed compared to, let's say, the number of patients with lymphoma or rheumatoid arthritis that get it. So, but still, some hospitals have to apply to kind of central drugs regulators, which can hold things up a bit.
So with that being said, with rituximab, do you treat every patient up front with rituximab?
Yes, and that's from experience, because if you leave it, it just prolongs the agony. Now, that has changed a bit with Kaplan, because we have now a therapy which normalizes the platelet count quicker. So there is, you know, potentially an argument to leave the rituximab for a day or two longer, but actually patients still need it. If they will relapse, it would be most unusual where they don't relapse after discharge without rituximab.
That's another interesting question I would have for you. So how, before I ask you something else about preemptive rituximab, which you know a lot about, how do you follow patients? So when a patient's discharged from your hospital in London, how do you follow them? How often do you see them? What do you do?
So for the first, you know, couple of weeks, I seen at least twice a week. And usually part of that is we can finish the rituximab course off as an outpatient now because they get out so early with Kaplan. And then they're seen weekly for about a month. And certainly now, while they're on Kaplan as an outpatient, we see them weekly to give them the next course of therapy. So they don't get months worth at a time. Once everything's stable, we then go to monthly for 2 to 3 months, then every 3 months, and then 6 monthly if the ADAMTS 13 is okay. But if it starts to look like it's dipping, we bring them back a bit sooner.
Back a bit sooner.
Yeah.
That certainly makes sense. So you'll monitor the ADAMTS13 activity.
Yes.
At these visits. And what will get your attention to start talking about the preemptive or prophylactic or preventive rituximab in that patient sitting in front of you? What's your
So we talk about that from day one, because obviously one of the questions is, will I get this again? And we talk about it every visit. You know, we're doing the ADAMTS 13 today. This is the reason we're doing it. If it drops, we may need to see you sooner. If it goes to 15%, 20%, or you have symptoms, we will give you rituximab, and this is why. So we talk about it every visit so that if they do need it, because it still can be quite frightening, even coming just into a daycare setting, you know, that they need to have more therapy. And then it goes back to thinking about the previous acute TTP episode. We try to reduce, you know, the overall shock if they do need it, although they tolerate it very well. It's just the thought of TTP may relapse, but it generally doesn't actually.
So is there a threshold you'd say is an absolute threshold to put somebody on rituximab?
So we're looking at, 15, 20%, but some patients have symptoms above that level. So we have used it at higher levels than that in the odd case. I mean, they can get very symptomatic actually.
Certainly. So the other question I would ask you is, you've done some work with lower dose options. Evan Sadler's group previously had done some work. What dose do you use? The standard 375 per meter squared or something different?
Acutely, we use what we call the lymphoma dose. So that's the standard authorized dose. And we have a couple of times used the 200. I just don't think in the acute setting it's the time to be playing around with dosing regimes. But for elective or preventative treatment, we can use any of the doses and are doing a randomized trial at the moment.
Ah, very interesting. Very interesting. What do you think, if you can say, and I think you can with the work you've done with caplacizumab and rituximab and plasma exchange, the upfront treatment is much better. We might be shrinking that 15% mortality rate down to much lower, closer to zero. So what do you view as the most significant, challenging clinical issue that needs to be addressed in the next 5 years for all of your trainees down the road?
So one is continuing the education, because without that, we can't send them out as senior doctors to continue to recognize TTP. And it can present in many forms. It doesn't have to be, you know, acute in a coma. It can be much, let's call it milder, but it's not a mild disease. To get rid of plasma exchange. It's an archaic therapy, which causes its own problems, time consuming and distressing. It's the most distressing thing for patients, not the plasma exchange, but just putting in large lines. So the use of eventually recombinant ADAMTS13 with cap plus steroids and rituximab is all our ideal goal for the treatment of acute TTP.
Yeah, I certainly think that's where things headed. You've done a bit of work. We've worked together on projects together, looking at long-term.
Sorry, can I just tell my dog to be quiet? Hold on one second. Usually he's catching flies behind me, so it's only a little bark. Sorry about that. Carry on.
I hope I didn't offend him. I don't want to get him mad. I would say we've done work together. You've done work on your own, looking at sort of how patients function, how they do well into remission. Because I think in the majority, nearly all, not all, but you can prevent relapse in the majority of patients. So these long-term complications, what do you think about those? How do you monitor patients for those in the clinic? Once you get 6 months out, you're not talking about preemptive rituximab. How do you talk about these issues?
Well, of course, that's been something that's happened over the last few years. So I go back to when we first started looking after acute TTP patients and doing it with, you know, you and I, that it was about getting them through this acute episode. And I think that things have improved. And so now we recognize rightly that it is a more chronic disease. And one of the big issues is anxiety and depression. And that's something that we ask patients about repeatedly because they need support from a clinical psychologist. More of them need it, not just one or two patients. And often they don't realize that they do need this level of support. So we look at some monitors, just quick assessments. And the one we use is PHQ-9, which gives you it just gives you a number, but it helps the clinical psychologists to assess the degree of urgency, let's call it. The next thing we do more frequently is neurocognitive assessments, and these have been very, very useful. There's no point doing them if patients have anxiety or depression, so we do it much later on, but it sometimes give patients solace in their symptoms. So it can assess whether they're comparable to their baseline or if there's been specific deterioration in one or two areas. And then we can work on that and try and improve their symptoms, which generally stabilize over time. It's not normal that they deteriorate, but it just gives them answers to why they feel their memory's not right, or their speech isn't right, or they can't formulate words. So these are really important long-term issues that we address all the time in the series of questions that we ask in clinic.
No, they're excellent. So you'll actually monitor and measure these objective tools like some centers in the States do too. The serial follow-up, which is certainly very important. I've got a question for you from the audience. It says, do you treat people with long-term immune suppressants such as mycophenolate to prevent relapse when ADAMTS13 and platelets are normal?
We do sometimes. There are some patients that are on it long-term, and we will stop it. And there are a couple where the ADAMT starts to drift back down, so they go straight back on it. The reason that a number of patients are on mycophenolate initially is it works quite well with rituximab to try and normalize the ADAMTS13 in the first instance, but we don't usually leave patients on it long term. We will, after a period of normal ADAMTS13, stop the mycophenolate and see what happens.
Very much like the rituximab, doing this therapy without the benefit of the ADAMTS13 monitoring is really a poor idea. You really need to have some guidance.
Yeah.
No, I would definitely agree with you. Let me We don't want to monopolize your entire time this evening.
It's fine. Ask as many questions as you like.
Yeah, I'm learning all kinds of good
Your
stuff.
audience are very quiet.
So let's switch gears, because there's been a lot of questions about congenital TTP and recombinant ADAMTS13, and you've been centrally involved with phase 1 study in congenital TTP patients with recombinant, as well as multiple patients enrolled, I'm certain, with the present study that's ongoing.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about that? What's the future for that?
I mean, it's fabulous. I can't tell you how fabulous it is. You know, patients just feel so much better. It's much nicer than having plasma. There's no doubt about that. Even plasma that doesn't cause reactions, you know, the whole turning up, having to sit there for hours is quite unpleasant and quite tiring. So they really have done brilliantly within the trial on recombinant ADAMPS. The key, however, is to ensure that we are giving it frequently enough. So as clinicians, we were taught that ADAMTS13 has a very long half-life. That means that it can be around for much longer than other enzymes. But actually, and as a consequence of that, we thought that patients would only need top-up who have congenital TTP every 3 or 4 weeks. But actually, that does not appear, certainly in our experience, to be the case. So we have the majority of patients are on weekly treatment. And that keeps their ADAMPS nice and high, and they really just feel so much better.
So you're saying weekly treatments are part of a clinical trial, the study, correct?
No. So you as part of the study, you put them on whatever frequency that you would normally do. So the vast majority of ours now are on weekly treatment, and that's because even though they're better having plasma infusion before recombinant ADAMTS13, they were still getting symptoms, and you can reduce those down so significantly with weekly treatment. And so when they started on the trial, because they're on weekly plasma, they go on weekly recombinant.
Gotcha. Okay. That's a bit different than the one present study. That's interesting, though, because weekly, many patients may need weekly plasma infusions, but they don't tolerate nor want to tolerate coming to your clinic every week to get an infusion. It's a several-hour experience that leaves them drained. So, I mean, where do you see the future of recombinant ADAMTS13? Are they going to get treated in your clinic? Or are they going to be treated at home like a hemophilia patient? Yeah, no, at home, definitely, and which is just brilliant. So, you know, especially if we're giving it, or a nurse comes in to give it weekly, some are on 2 weekly, it's just so less disturbing for their life, because often patients have quite a way to travel to go to sort of central site. I can't wait for it to be authorised, and basically the day it's authorised, I'm going to try and get everyone in the UK on it. It's just so much nicer. It really does work. So a bit like when we did Kaplan trials, you know, you're a bit nervous what would happen, and you could see, you know, benefit in some patients above others. And certainly now that we use it all the time, it's standard, it works much better. The same as with recombinant, it really does work and make patients feel very good. Well, you know, you and I both know, when you run against the grain and go against an idea that's been entrenched for 60 years, whether it's supported by data or not, you ruffle some feathers. And if you envision a world of congenital TTP and immune-mediated TTP that's no longer treated by plasma exchange or plasma infusion, it's sort of an interesting idea. It'd be fabulous. I mean, you know, plasma is great. I mean, it's, you know, it's the only source that we currently have of ADAMTS13, but giving plasma for congenital, you can only get the level to about 30%. And with recombinant, you get it straight up to 100%. And then you can maintain a really good ADAMTS13 level by giving it frequently, i.e. weekly. Then we can ask you the next question: what's the right level to achieve during follow-up? Yeah, well, I mean, there has been a lot of debate about that, but surety has definitely shown us the importance of having a normalized ADAMTS13 and what happens if you don't in immune-mediated TTP. And I think the congenital groups that are published have demonstrated
You may have a normal platelet count, but if the ADAMTS13 is still reduced, patients are very symptomatic. And it's not, you know, it's terrible headaches that we can't understand, and the tiredness that just dissipates by giving them recombinant ADAMTS13.
Let me ask you a quick question that came from the audience, that with your experience in being one of the lead investigators and discovered this rare vaccine-induced thrombocytopenia and thrombosis. So are there any COVID vaccinations that you would not recommend for a TTP patient you're taking care of?
No, because it doesn't affect TTP patients. Although many countries now have authorized that AstraZeneca is not given below a certain age group. So the group of patients who get this vaccine-induced immune thrombocytopenia and thrombosis, albeit it sounds similar to TTP and it's treated similar in some ways to TTP, TTP patients are not more at risk of developing it. In general, people are coming in who've never had medical problems before. So having a prior condition, even one like TTP, does not make you more at risk.
Very good, thank you. One quick question. So what we've learned in TTP, whether it's the ADAMTS13 or the long-term complications of this microthrombotic disease, whether it's congenital or immune mediated, where's the next step? How is what we're learning in TTP going to apply to other diseases? You know,
well, yes, I mean, stroke is the most obvious, but also things like sepsis, potentially, where you've got very high protein, the von Willebrand factor that ADAMTS13 needs to cut down. It can't do it if the levels are so high, if you're so acutely unwell. Heart disease, other things like potentially diabetes. They've looked at ADAMTS13 in most conditions now. And it's not that it's low as in TTP, it's just the balance with von Willebrand factor means that it just can't control the environment. And if you give therapy to help bring down the von Willebrand factor, the big protein that ADAMTS works on, often things normalize much quicker. So it's really important that we get a good understanding of the relationship and the symptoms. And I think the use of some of the therapies will be applicable in other disease areas, more common diseases.
More common ones. Well, we've taken up enough of your time, my lady, and I appreciate everything you've done and join us and go out of your way so late in the evening on a Saturday.
No, it's fine. It's my pleasure.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. We hope to see you here in the States in December for our hematology meeting.
Thank you very much, Spero, and goodbye, everybody. Have a good meeting.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Take care, Marie.
Do you want to just stay up there and we'll do final remarks?
Let's do that. My shirt's warm. That's kind of gross. I appreciate that. Run the show.
All right, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We just want to do a few final remarks. Just say thank you for joining us. You will be receiving a after the meeting survey to let us know what you want to see next year, what went well, what didn't go well. We're really, really hoping next year will be in person. And so we will also still keep an option to attend virtually, but we will be offering in-person attendance, which I think will be a great opportunity for everybody. We want to thank our sponsors, Sanofi, Takeda, and Alexion. All of them, this wouldn't have been possible without. And we want to thank all of our investigators and presenters. It was great to be able to have that and share with that today.
Dedication of the investigators to be involved both in person, to travel here, as well as those at a distance, our new foundation board members that help guide the content. We appreciate that, and sticking it out all day long with us. Which can be quite a long day, so we do appreciate that. And as Claire had mentioned, please let us know what you thought. We really do want to know what you like, what you want more of, what you want less of, and it'll help us shape the meeting for next summer, as well as our content throughout the year periodically with Ask the Hematologist sessions and other things that can be helpful. just let us know what helps.
And if there's anything that didn't get answered today or anything that you want to reach out and talk to us about, you can reach us through our website, USTMAconsortium.com, or email us at admin, ADMIN, at USTMAconsortium.com. You can reach us either way, and we try to respond within at least 24 hours. So, thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.